Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So it is Friday on the Auron McIntyre Show, and for those that are fans, you are familiar with what that means. We have some Theory Friday, often including my good friend the Prudentialist coming on to break down a little bit of Nick Land. And we began our dive into his kind of seminal essay, Meltdown, last week. So we're back at it again today because this is large and complex and takes a very long time to unpack. And you desperately hope that you're right and not making a fool of yourself while you're doing it. So Prudentialist, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's one of the few shows where we don't get to talk about current events, and I don't get to rant about immigration, but we're going to try and find a way to do it anyways.
I feel like I work that in at least 2 to 3 times a week, but whenever you feel it necessary to jump in about the collapse of civilization due to mass migration, feel free. It's always a point worth making. All right, guys, we're going to get into Nick Land, picking up where we left off last week, again, in that essay Meltdown. But before we do, let me tell you a little bit about today's sponsor. Don't kid yourself. The future of the Supreme Court is on the ballot. The radical left want to eliminate the court's conservative majority by packing the Supreme Court with their own hand-picked justices to get the outcome that they want. Even President Biden has gotten into the act by making reforming the court one of his final priorities before he leaves office. But don't be fooled, their endgame really is to pack the court. At First Liberty, they call this assault on the court what it really is, a Supreme Court coup. The frightening thing is that come January, their plan could become our nation's reality. Simple majority votes in the House and the Senate, combined with the president's signature, could turn their plan to pack the court into law. That's why First Liberty is sounding the alarm, and they need you to join them. If we take action together, if we unite our voices, we can put a stop to the radical left's plan to take control of the Supreme Court. As the 2024 election approaches, we need to do 3 things. Find out where each of your candidates stand on the radical issues of packing and purging the court. Share what you learn with everyone, and do your civic duty by voting. The future of the court, or preserving it as an independent judiciary, is literally in your hands. If we lose the court, then we lose the country. That's why First Liberty is taking action, and they need all of us to join them. With patriots like you standing for the Supreme Court, we can safeguard the independence of the judiciary, just as the Founding Fathers intended. And by saying no to the left's Supreme Court coup, we can secure the blessings of liberty and protect the future of our constitutional rights for our children and grandchildren. Please go to supremecoup.com/Auron. That's supremecoup.com/Auron to learn how you can help stop the radical left's takeover of the Supreme Court. All right, diving back into the essay here, Meltdown. If you did not see the previous episode, I highly suggest that you do that. This is something that requires a good deal of context at the best of times. And so if you jump in right here on episode 2, you might be a little lost and confused. So we picked up in this section called Heat, or we ended in this section called Heat last time. And the first paragraph we're looking at here is a quote from a postmodern novel. It's Don, how do we say it? Don DeLillo?
Don DeLillo or something like that.
Yeah, it's a White Noise.
I've only read Lieber. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Yeah, I've never read any of his work, so this one's a little out of left field for me, but I guess it does fit in the context of what Nick Land is talking here. So this section I'm about to read is just this quote from this novel. Heat. This is what cities mean to me. You get off the train and walk out of the station, and you're hit with the full blast, the heat of the air, traffic, and people, the heat of food and sex, the heat of tall buildings, the heat that flows out of the subway and tunnels. It's always 15 degrees hotter in the cities. Heat rises from the sidewalks and falls from the poisoned sky. The buses breathe heat. Heat emanates from the crowds of shoppers and office workers. The entire infrastructure is based on heat. Desperately uses up heat, breeds more heat. The eventual heat death of the universe that scientists love to talk about is already well underway, and you can feel it happening all around you in any large or medium-sized city. Heat and wetness. Now, I don't have the particular context of that novel, so there might be a far deeper meaning implied here, but I would surmise that this reference is here in no small part because what we're about to read is going to focus a lot on entropy and extropy, the dissipation and the following of heat flows and energy flows when it comes to the creation of processes and civilizations. And so I would imagine that the reference is connected to that, but there may be more there. That's what I know.
Yeah, I haven't read the book either. Like I said, I've only read Libra, but I think it fits perfectly well with all the other sort of concepts we talk about, both on your channel and mine, whether it be cities as IQ shredders or just how capital or just immigration or virtually anything that comes together is only going to accelerate the forces of the left, which is entropy.
An explosion of chaotic weather within synthetic problem solving rips through the last dreams of top down prediction and control. Knowledge adds to the mess, and this is merely exponentiated by knowing what it does. So, over and over again, from different angles, we're going to get this approach from Nick Land about the kind of the creative chaos of this process breaking through human control on a regular basis, especially when it comes to control of the economy, control of production in society, and even knowing about this, understanding that this is part of what's happening in the process does not slow it down. In fact, it only accelerates it. And I think that's something we're going to see repeated throughout the essay. Capital is machinic, non-instrumental. Globalization, miniaturization, scaling, dilation, an automatizing, nihilistic vortex, neutralizing all values through commensuration to digitized commerce, and driving a migration from despotic command to cyber-sensitive control, from status and meaning to money and information. So, capital is machinic in the sense that it is not, instrumental. It's not serving a human purpose in this case. When it talks about the nihilistic vortex, talking about the capitalism serving itself and non-human ends. It's only self-referential. It's only about creating and making that process more efficient. And so it's going to be removing itself from despotic command, from the command of humans, from the command of human systems, that top-down control that he mentioned earlier, and instead is going to become cyber-sensitive. It's no longer interested in the human indicators of status and meaning, and instead is focused on money and information. So once again, separating itself from the human, separating itself from human incentives or understandings, and instead becoming a process that drives itself and references only itself through things like money and information.
Yeah, and I think that this is also illustrating the last forms of nation state forms of governments that we talk about. So what might be considered top down with respects to prediction, what we were reading earlier, or even just despotic command, essentially just one ruler or a centralized bureaucratic state. Now it's just everywhere. So now we've transferred status not just from meaning, but also say like landed gentry or an aristocratic bloodline or any sort of higher strata classes. Now everything's about information, and you see this whether it be about insider trading or how we witnessed like the Pelosi's make a lot of money by shorting Visa right before Congress decides to investigate it for antitrust laws. And in doing so, information and money is really what's going to buy you power, and especially in an environment where the human consciousness is now expanded. I mean, a lot of this was also, you can build upon this from, say, McLuhan in the 1960s. Like the speed of information of his time made you instantaneously aware of like famines in India or what was going on in parts of Lebanon and Beirut. Not much has really changed in that respect. It illustrates, right, how we're instantly aware of people's lives halfway around the world. And now with the 24/7 news cycle, and I was talking about this earlier this morning with Conscious Caracol on his channel, that all of a sudden you have to be instantly aware of what's going on at all times. And that creates a take economy. So now information and money are ways in which we have power. If you were an excellent predictor, let's say like our friend Battle Beagle on Twitter, who makes these wonderful predictions that have a terrifying tendency of coming true about the economy or global events, that all of a sudden elevates you to status, gives you power, gives you people consult to you for what's going to happen next. And now with those forces moving faster and faster and faster, it's harder for the regular person to understand, and it now only serves itself. It no longer has that instrumentality to where, oh, well, like I create something, I get money, I can create a good for other people. No, now it just builds upon itself. And in doing so, it's sort of going to take out the old human model of what makes us exciting or human or dynamic or innovative. It's just going to say that is no longer part of the equation. Humanity itself is a stumbling block.
Yeah, it really is a radical revolution in the way that power works. It's no longer tied to these very distinctly human markers, like you said, the landed gentry, the people are a part of the land. They're living in the cycles of the land. They're the rhythms of the land. They owe this fealty to someone who can move men in a very traditional sense. Now all of this is digitized. It's incredibly liquid. It's incredibly rapid, and the way that all of these things, even the human parts like status, are organized are very different. And so it's just a complete radical revolution in the way the power is understood. Let's see, where did I leave off here? There we go. Its function and formation are indissociable, comprising a teleeconomy, and that is, I made sure to check my definitions here. That's a purple. I may have definitions, but I can't use words. It's the purposefulness of a particular structure inside evolution. So it's the evolution of something for a particular purpose. Machine code capital recycles itself through its axiomatic of consumer control, laundering out the shit and bloodstains of primitive accumulation. So once again, we see this idea of getting rid of the human. We're using this idea of consumer control, right? That consumer preference it becomes this axiomatic mechanism. It becomes this really basic standard for the way that things should be filtered, the way that they should be understood. But in that shift to this understanding of how things should be organized, it's laundering out these very normal and human understandings of accumulation. So we're again radically shifting the way that people select for things, even in economic interactions.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much on point here. Is that anything that would launder out parts of the human understanding of what's important: food, land, resources, water. Yeah, no, we don't need that anymore. The paperclip factory is up and running, and it certainly does not need human hands.
Each part of the system encourages maximal sumptuous expenditure, while the system as a whole requires its inhibition. Schizophrenia. Disassociated consumers destine themselves as worker bodies to cost control. And for those who aren't familiar, the idea of capitalism and schizophrenia, of course, as we referenced last week, so much of what Land is doing is part of Deleuze and Guattari. It takes a lot of their work in Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus and applies many of the different concepts here. And once again, we see this schizophrenic nature of the process, where it is encouraging these maximal expenditures, right? But it also requires their inhibition. So these two things are at cross purposes, and then once again the disassociated consumer destines themselves as worker bodies to cost control.
Yeah, and also this is a really great sort of back and forth because you're seeing cost control. So one might think austerity, but on top of that, you're talking about sumptuous expenditures. So like the most lavishly kind of ways of spending is possible. And again, money being a form of status, a lot of us end up seeing like majority of America, for example, having thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of credit card debt, in which we're trying to keep up with the Joneses, but also to maintain a lavish lifestyle. I mean, even the poorest of Americans are not only obese, but can have an iPhone, and a lot of this is due to Gibbs. But it does illustrate that, we have a system that is in place to where, well, really, we're desiring to produce in order for us to have these status, these things that are going there, and the things that would require us to be human or to enjoy the simpler pleasures of life, whether it be a family or, sort of a teleological basis in meaning, whether it be religion or something else. All that gets thrown out the window for moving towards a higher purpose of production. And so we become a slave to that sort of production. We desire that production in order to maintain status. It's gamed against us. You basically, as it says in the passage, become enslaved.
You can also see this in the dynamic that current states seem to want to set up with their economic systems, where we're constantly encouraging people to spend as much money as possible, become as lavish as possible. You need to constantly pushing your budget, leveraging yourself, incurring more and more debt. Making these large purchases. We never want the economy to slow down. We never want it to cool, but simultaneously we're encouraging austerity inside the system. The state itself is recognizing the limits of its ability to constantly spend, especially in many of the programs that it's already made the individual completely reliant on. So again, just this cross purposes. The system constantly requires overspending and an abandonment of understanding of the future, saving in any of these low time preference behaviors. They're all bad for the economy in some sense, but you would recognize that you actually do need that austerity, that low time preference in the long run, and these things are constantly at odds and constantly clashing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Capital history's machinic spine is coded, axiomated, and diagrammed by a disequilibrium technoscience of irreversible indeterministic and increasingly nonlinear processes associated successively with thermotechnics, which is the science of tracking the movement of heat, the flow of heat and energy. Signaletics, which apparently is a term that Deleuze uses in other work. I had not run into this one specifically, but it's talking about the way that images are processed and time is understood when it comes to cinema in movies, the way that it's processed there. Again, kind of signals and signifiers in that context. Cybernetics, complex system dynamics, and artificial life. Modernity marks itself out as hot culture, captured by a spiraling involvement with entropy, deviations, camouflaging an invasion from the future, launching back out of terminated security against everything that inhibits the meltdown process. So this process of capital escape, this process of acceleration, is basically modernity represents itself as these different parts of the terminated security system, the human security system, going back and kind of retroactively eliminating anything that would actually stop the process. So in many ways, the very attempt of the nation's the human interests to control this process accelerates the process. It actually ends up annihilating the things that are most effective in stopping the process as it goes along.
Yeah, and it's funny. I can't help but think of the immediate aftermath after September 11th, 2001, where President Bush is telling everyone to go shopping. You had those T-shirts that said, terrorists aren't going to stop my shopping spree or my vacation. We've retroactively taken, the national response to things is now just to spend. But on top of that, the purposes of, say, anything that could be, seen as an outside the system or an outside marketplace way of existing in subsistence, whether that be, religious communities or purposeful, commune or any kind of living that isn't sort of bought into this. I'm not just saying that communes are the only way that you get out of it. I'm not advocating for that in this situation, but anything that is going to sort of put itself as a bulwark against a system that wants you to be spending at all times and to be consuming at all times, and to let yourself more or less be essentially deterritorialized and deracinated to where you are a brand identitarian, and that's just about it. And you see this quite happen in America a lot for Texas, not only just due to immigration, but also just how we've marketed ourselves, that we went from, say, great, sword and sandals style epics in the 1950s and 60s about the Alamo or these wild westerns, these ways in which we were telling the stories about America and ourselves. Now, really, if you look at Texas identity, it's more about things like Whataburger, HEB, Buc-ee's, the Dallas Mavericks, the Dallas Stars, things like that, less than they were these traditional rooted in locations, because we live here style identities. And instead, we've allowed ourselves to essentially take what is important, tradition, identity, relations to other people, family, and we've commoditized it to such a format, and not just by we, but we also mean the system that we participate in, which is trying to override us, is now simply saying, okay, that doesn't matter. We can make this a market entity, and we're going to ensure that the idea of family formation, the idea of this, we're now going to add on sort of this back catalog of things that come with it. Therefore, the likelihood of you having a successful resistance is not likely. I mean, it's kind of funny that J.D. Vance was referencing a paper not too long ago about how car seats are contraceptives. I mean, if you're wanting to look at a meltdown process to stop like family formation inhibition, like that would be the way to look at it.
There you go. Yeah, that's a good example. Hot cultures tend to social disillusion. They're innovative and adaptive. They always trash and recycle cold cultures. Primitive models have no subversive use. So, Prudentialist and I were kicking this back and forth before the stream. Not sure if hot cultures has any kind of technical meaning. I was not able to find it beyond. Both of us stumbled on the same, like, really dumb, gay race communism. If it's a tropical culture, it's open and everybody loves each other, and they're, cold cultures are mean and they're not open to change and these kind of things. But we both kind of agreed that we think and of course this is not perfect, guys. We're doing our best to try to understand the essay, but understand I'm sure we're making mistakes, and somewhere people are yelling at us, but we are doing our best. So in this instance, it looks like hot cultures, unless it has some other technical meaning that we're not aware of, is talking about dynamic cultures that perhaps if you want to put it in like a Pareto understanding, that tend to be dominated by type 1 residues, people who are interested in constant combination, constantly trying to break apart and build new systems, these kind of things. And what he's saying is that, the ones that are interested in innovation and adaptation almost always end up trashing these cultures that are attempting to resist it, right? Again, you could think about something like the opening of Japan and China, right? Like these are cultures that are trying to use traditional forms to be highly resistant to the entrance of a more global culture of capital and trade and ideas and culture, all these things flowing in. But he says that the primitive models, they have no subversive use, and so therefore those cultures just getting trashed and recycled by the hot cultures because they're the ones that are constantly trying to feed the revolution, basically.
Yeah, the other thing too to consider with, say, a hot culture would be anything that has the opportunity to resist. They say dissolution, and I think that that's what they're aiming for with hot cultures, say capital or any sort of enslaving type system. But I think that when you have a hot culture, you're striving towards dynamism. You're trying to resist the inertia of resistance. And I think to some extent you see that a lot in these conversations about vitalism in sort of the American right, or at least in some parts of it. Because if you're trying to be adaptive and to be innovative and trying to survive this ongoing hellscape that you're trying to survive and manage in, you have to look towards the past and see if there's anything, or towards outside of the world and see if there's anything it's useful for you. And I think when we talk about like cold cultures, that they always get trashed or recycled, that these primitivist models have no subversive use to, say, capital. That's in part because I think that you're not going to see that they're not going to have the same kind of immunological response to these ideas that, say, you and I do. I mean, despite the fact that a lot of problems of what we would call wokeness have its origins in post-60s America and the academy and our legal structure, that most Americans who are on the right have a stronger sort of immunological response to them than, say, our friends in South Africa or something like that. I mean, our resistance to CRT or like gay marriage or something like that is going to be far stronger than, say, what we see across the pond or something like that. And to witness that sort of colonization by entropic forces means that maybe these old school models aren't going to help us as much as we want to. And in doing so, we're kind of witnessing both struggle in this like death grip against modernity, but by extension, accelerating capital.
An excellent point. The Turing test, monetarism. I'm just going to destroy all the words today. Monetarizing power tends to effacement of specific territorial features as it programs for migration into cyberspace. Capital only retains anthropological characteristics as a symptom of underdevelopment. That's going to be a really important phrase there. Reformatting primitive behavior as inertia to be dissipated in self-reinforcing artificiality. Man is something to be overcome, a problem, a drag, which, of course, you'd already hit on earlier. But it's this idea that by turning, by going ahead and turning power into this monetized force, you can remove the specific territorial features. You can remove the specific features that are binding capital and these energies to the human, to the specific, the particular, and you can tear that apart as you prepare things to move into cyberspace. Capital is only retaining those anthropological characteristics as a symptom of underdevelopment. So capital that is still serving humanity, capital that is still taking on human characteristics, is only capital that is underdeveloped. It is only retaining those because it has not yet shed itself of those characteristics. And so it's reformulating these primitive behaviors so they can be dissipated through artificiality. You can channel those impulses into something artificial and further remove these vestigial human characteristics from the capital process.
I mean, a really good example of this would be, say, trying to expose. I think there was already an article about this where I think Starlink was brought to some, distant, cut off Polynesian tribe or somewhere in like the East Pacific area. And, like a week or two later, all of the men were addicted to just hardcore pornography because they had never been exposed to that before. And so now you've basically turned yourself into a particular species of beetle that confuses its female counterpart for just like a brown glass bottle, and it sends it into overdrive. And so, these subversive models that we might say, oh, if we just return to this sort of past, like, tribal structure, maybe this will work. But when we look towards, say, the underdeveloped or the third world, that doesn't necessarily hold up. And instead, inside of our own system, as we're trying to fight back against it, we fall into these traps of artificiality, whether it be parasocial relationships, whether it be sort of the take economy, constantly monetizing predictions and takes. But at the same time, what makes humanity human, whether that be rooted in some belief in a higher power, whether that be the desire to procreate and to move on. Instead, we're going to inhabit a world where, well, it doesn't matter if I have children, we can, bring in more people, as someone like Peter Zeihan might say in his book, The End of the World is Just Beginning. But in this case, all that that's doing is accelerating the fact that, people who belong to a certain place and a certain territory and borders, that doesn't matter. You are all equally replaceable widgets.
Back to our essay here. Commoditization conditions define technics as substitute for human activity, counted as wage costs. Industrial machines are deployed to dismantle the actuality of the proletariat, displacing it into the direction of cyborg hybridization and realizing the plasticity of labor power. The corresponding extraction of tradable value from the body quantifies as productivity, sophisticated at the interface. WorkTrack's thermodynamic is I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce this, negentropy, which I guess is just extropy. It's just the reversal of entropy. I'm not sure why I chose that particular term. Extropy is a lot easier to say. But anyway, by disassociating exertion into increasingly intricate functional sequences from pedals, levers, and vocal commands through the synchronization of production line tasks and time motion programs to sensory motor transduction within increasingly complex and self-micromanaged artificial environments, capturing minutely adaptive behaviors for the commodity. Auto-cyberneting market control guides the labor process into immersion. So once again, we're talking about, in this case, the dehumanizing of the labor process itself by dismantling it down into its constituent parts, breaking it down as minutely as possible and maximizing each one of these, breaking down the processes and reassembling them in the most efficient manner. We are creating this scenario where we're dehumanizing the labor process and making it as efficient as possible to serve, again, non-human ends. You have auto-cybernating market control guides the labor process into immersion. You're taking it away from its interest in serving the human, serving those human-oriented, even market conditions, and instead the market is auto-cybernating. It is making these small adjustments constantly, internally, self-referentially, only interested in what increases its power, increases its efficiency, increases its reach.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to take a look at here, though, like the negentropy, which is just, what might be called negative entropy, or in statistics, it's usually associated with distance to what's considered normal. How far have you deviated from the average or the mean? And so, I mean, thermodynamic negentropism is, by dissociating exertion into increasingly intricate functional sequences, from pedals to levers, vocals, like all this is simply telling you that now we're going to make sure that you are constantly on board, being produced at all times. No longer can you work from home on your computer, or no longer can you work from home in your office, but now if your camera is on, your eyes are being tracked. You notice this on some of those more strict work from home environments, that they're measuring how active you are on your computer. They're measuring your keystrokes. You have to be working at all times. And in doing so, as it goes back towards the end here, sensory motor transduction with increasingly complex and self-micromanaged artificial environments. I mean, whether it be the workspace, or you have your little cry room inside like the Amazon wish fulfillment area. I like how Amazon has reinvented the suicide booth from Futurama. Except it's free, or like, well, we see it in Canada too. It's state sponsored. But again, all of these things
healthcare, buddy. That's healthcare.
Yeah, it's healthcare. That's right. True. The death drive is fully complete in Canada. But on top of that, like, all these things are just trying to break down any semblance of what's considered human. And my hot take at the beginning of like the whole COVID thing was like, you're actually going to see this really weird line get blurred between your workplace now being in your home, or in your office, in your bedroom, because now the traditional boundary between work and home has been more or less dissolved and destroyed. I mean, it was already destroyed with our cell phones, right? Because now the boss can call us anytime, and you're on call 24/7, even if you have set hours. But all these things are trying to bring market control into immersion. This is very much building off of what Deleuze describes as the control society. It gives you the idea that you're in charge and you're in control, but actually your desire to produce, your desire to be a body is now being used against you, and you're being controlled by either market or political forces that you can't see.
Back to our essay here. The investment income class advantages itself of commodity dynamics, but only by conforming to the axiomatic of the neutral profit maximization, facilitating the dehumanization of wealth, and by sidelining the sidelining of non-productive consumption. So again, we see that yes, investment exists, investment opportunities exist, but they are only advantage when they basically ignore the human aspects of consumption. They are you can make money, you can make money in investments, the investment community can be profitable, but only as it basically invests, or it embraces this axiomatic of neutral profit maximization. So I don't really care about what the product does. I don't really care if the product is serving the end that it was designed to. I don't care about its contextualization in any kind of moral context, or any other understanding of human purpose. The only way that I'm going to, the incentive structure for my investment is going to be by basically just this profit maximization, which is increasingly sidelining any non-productive consumption, any purely human interest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like that meme that's been going around. It's like, oh, I guess we're making triangles now. Like the system does not care. You need to be producing at all times, and this is the way that we're going to do it. Any concern about, say, like the left climate stuff is a really great example of this. Well, it's like, oh, we just want you to like have a lower quality of life, and we're actually going to purposely deindustrialize ourselves in order to like transition this economy to completely online and to be a service-based economy. We'll rely on others to do it. Sort of this like weird mixture of like European Californian ideology, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, the rest of the world is going to advance further ahead of you. I mean, whether it be China investing more in nuclear reactors, trying to get away, building more coal-fired power plants. Again, while you're complaining about, say, oh, the status of the economy, or the sort of like, sort of socialist eschatology that comes with, we must insert utopianism now via Green New Deal or whatever. That's going to get blurred to the sideline because, well, there are going to be others that are far more powerful than you. I mean, this is the whole sort of neo-China arise from the future bit, but also at the same time, it doesn't matter. You need to be producing something. You will accept the austerity because you're just going to be a cog that we can easily replace by bringing in more Syrians or something.
The cyberpunk security of self-organizing planetary commoditronics escaped nominal bourgeoisie control in the late 19th century, provoking technocratic corporatist, i.e. fascist and social democratic political structures in allergic reaction. So we talked about a little bit about this in the previous stream, the first section, but the emergence of what we understand now as many of these kind of managerial systems, while they are themselves increasingly inhuman, and they drive people to become increasingly inhuman. They are in many ways a desperate attempt of humanity to attempt to recapture this process. So the technocratic corporatist process is really is an allergic reaction to this escape of this planetary commercium that Nick Land is describing. This process escaping the control of the bourgeois, and so the bourgeois order cannot hold. Not just because a lot of people hate it. It's not just the Marxist revolution or whatever. It's also the desire to make sure that these processes still serve human ends. That states and these other entities, these human-centered entities, continue to maintain a degree of control. So be it rather, it could be fascist, it could be communist. Either way, these political structures are desperately trying to outrace these developments that are quickly leaving all of these human structures behind.
Yeah, and this is an interesting bit of, say, post-structural, or maybe even just sort of the postmodern Marxist-oriented lens that they're talking about history. That the world of this cyberpunk techno-corporatist future that we're getting to, the reactions of social democracy, communism, fascism of the 20th and the 19th centuries, you can attempt to respond to what's coming with, say, like the Industrial Revolution, then and its consequences. But also, the simple fact is that now what we have seen is that, well, populations are just now in these sort of medical military corporations, a neo-mercantilist foreign policy, or like they're very kind of like neo-colonialists. We use resource extraction. We see this far more with, say, also with the Chinese, just as much as parts of the United States' economy. I would say more so than China nowadays, with a lot of its initiatives doing less and less localization. They're really resistant to that. I mean, even Tencent is a good example. Like, oh, it's a Chinese-owned company. Like, yes, it is. It's a state-operated enterprise with thousands of party members that are involved on there. They've learned very well from their Soviet counterparts during the 70s and 80s. But on that part, like, your reactions and new ideas of government are simply trying to respond to forces that are allegedly outside of whether it be capital's control or this entropic force of what capital is going to bring about, which you could say is like some sort of cyberpunk dystopia that our best science fiction writers have yet to describe. And to some extent, that's definitely true. We do live in a cyberpunk dystopia now. But I think it's sort of an interesting thing to just note here, that this is an interesting form of historical revisionism, because there are many that would say, well, like, actually, no, like, we operate under sort of a Marxist post-war consensus that advocates that Europe is not allowed to exist, America is not allowed to exist as it historically was, and instead you are going to be intermingled, mass migratory population centers, as we like to joke or say, rather tongue-in-cheek, but with depressing accuracy. These countries are turning more into economic zones that are just having its masters in government and media and corporations.
And that's why I find Nick Land so interesting, even though I may not agree with all of his ends or all of, even all of his analysis, is he is addressing the issue of the emergence of kind of this global managerial elite. But what he's describing is a containment mechanism for a process that is even further out of control than what we recognize. And so while we see the power that the state is wielding in its attempt to trying to get a grip, as he says repeatedly in the essay, on this process, it is dehumanizing people. It is destroying many of the things that we understand as deeply important to tradition and identity and human well-being. It's doing that in an attempt to catch up with something that is already outracing that so much faster. And so the different aspects of this feed into that process as well, which is what he says repeatedly again in the essay, is that the attempts of this broken human security system to retain control also exacerbate the condition. Also Nick Land says elsewhere that the critique of capitalism is to do more of it, right? Like, so attempting to contain this, the processes necessary to create this containment mechanism, the security mechanism, are themselves pushing you further and further into this process. And he continues that a little here. He says, the government structures of both Eastern and Western metropolitan centers consolidated themselves as population policing, medico-military complexes, which, man, doesn't that sound right? With neo-mercantilist foreign policy orientations. all such formations slid into irreversible crisis in the 1980s. So he's saying, yes, they are creating these, these kind of large global entities. They're bringing more and more people under the control. They're breaking down many of these ideas, but what they're really creating is is these government structures with these medico-military complexes, which are neo-mercantilists. They're trying to, in some ways, recontextualize those activities to the benefit of at least the zones of control that they have, right? So they are trying to, if not nationalize, because they're destroying the idea of the nation, then I don't know, can I make up words here? Hyper nationalized, or chase these larger structures, these larger entities, and still find a way to sublimate the kind of economic activity to the interests of those entities. So they're creating entities that we recognize as unhealthy for human flourishing, but still entities that are at least in some way serving the human. As where the capital process, the accelerationist process, is trying to take it entirely out of that context, like he said previously, removing those vestigial anthropomorphic aspects of the economy altogether.
Yeah, absolutely.
The postmodern meltdown of culture into the economy is triggered by the fractal interlock of commoditization and computers. A transscalar, which again I looked up my definitions here. It's a processor structure that spans multiple scales, usually referring to some kind of global process. Entropy dissipation from international trade to market-oriented software that thaws out competitive dynamics from the cryonics bank of modernist corporatism. So the modernist corporatism, these large modern structures that we recognize as an enemy of our preferred understanding of kind of more traditional human well-being, are themselves kind of this system of freezing this process in place. Again, attempting to control its human security systems, but the interlocking nature of commoditization and computers, technology and commoditization, allow it to basically escape this cryobank, as he called it, this prison that the modernist corporatism had built for this process.
Yeah, and that's sort of the thing here, and you can kind of also relate this a little bit to Spangler. Like, you have these iced, fossilized cultures. These things are now permanently baked in. They're only going to be iterating upon themselves. There's not going to be a lot of dynamism in here. And that cultural meltdown you can definitely see even here in the United States. And to build off of what we talked about in the previous episode, or even consumer identities. Remember, there are now 2 that are considered successful movies that are just biopics about products. And in fact, you can go even with 3, really. You have like The Founder with McDonald's and Ray Kroc. You've got one about Air Jordans with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. And then you have one about like the Flaming Hot Cheetos, which of course got in trouble for some sort of racist allegations or whatever. But like the fact that you have 3 different films that are now more recently come out and are focusing heavily upon product and brand biopics and their biographies and the men and women behind them in order to buy and sell and hawk more product. Like, those things are sort of just like locked in. We are frozen in loving our brands. And I think that you joke all the time that your students, when you were still teaching, could identify brands more than they could famous people or monuments or histories. And that stuff is now just going to be moving constantly towards, as it says towards the end of this paragraph at the top, market escalations based on the computer. And all those things are just going to tell you that, oh, well, what we're dealing with now are algorithms and data points that large language learning models will tell us, well, this is the ideal way to sell something. Even a lot of churches are like that now. Well, like, what kind of music should we play? Well, based on a demographic study, it says this. And we don't even use the word church anymore. We just call it like the crossing or something like that. And so all these things just get commoditized based upon algorithms, and they're just sort of built in now for all future economic planning.
Absolutely. Commerce re-implements space inside itself, assembling a universe exhaustively imminent to cyber capital functionality. So it's the process that is creating itself is also being influenced. It's imminent in the sense that it's constantly feeding back into itself and changing the process, readjusting the process. The causation is internal, not external to the process. It's no longer human. It's inside that functionality. Neoclassical equilibrium economics is assumed by computer-based non-equilibrium market escalation, themed by artificial agencies, imperfect information, suboptimal solutions, lock-in, increasing returns, and convergence. As digitally micro-tuned market meta-programs mesh with techno-scientific soft engineering, positive nonlinearity rages through the machine. Cyclonic torsion moans. So once again, we have this system that is, as you point out, just self-referential. We have market studies leading to market studies, AI that wants to take those market studies and synthesize it into more effective ways to create a more tantalizing market. These processes are increasingly just leaving any true human interaction, any true human interest behind, and instead there you have the biological aspects and the ways in which it can change the market. It can not just the market, but the person. It can actually engineer a better consumer in the sense of direct biological intervention, along with the technological advancements that are again speeding up that consumption cycle. Back to our meltdown here. The superiority of Far Eastern Marxism. Whilst Chinese materialist dialectic denegativizes itself in the direction of schizophrenia, excitement with schizophrenia, schizophrenizing the system's dynamics, progressively dissipating top-down historical destination in the Tao-drenched special economic zones, a Hegelianization of Western Marxism degenerates from the critique of political economy into state-sympathizing monotheology of economics, siding with fascism against deregulation, the self-subsidized into nationalistic conservatism, asphyxiating into vestigial capacity for hot speculative mutation in a morass of cold, depressive guilt culture. So basically, the Western, the Eastern Marxism, they're talking about the special economic zones here, right? So you have a communist China, but communist China allows for basically capital advancement in these specific zones, but it does so only in the attempt to try to turn that towards the interest of the nation, towards the Chinese process. Instead of siding with deregulation and the opening of the market, it basically, as it said, sides with fascism in the attempt to try to control these things, turn them to the will of the nation, turn them towards a human purpose, capture them inside these human security systems. And so he actually says the left becomes the nationalistic conservatives because they're trying to control this process in some kind of weird subversion of Marxism.
Yeah, and keep in mind that you're looking at sort of the state-owned state-owned enterprise system that we see sort of out of China, the special economic zone, and this has allowed them to more or less sign on to various practices, or say like the Paris Climate Accords or anything like that, and then to basically just turn around and ignore anything that they had said to placate the West. And in doing so, they're the ones that are going to keep building things. Now, there are a lot of things that I would say kind of go against them, and some of them I'm not sure I can say on here. But I think that one of the things to consider is that they just had like a nuclear-powered submarine like sink in port. Like, it did not go well. There are some things to say that there might be some kinks in that model. But at the same time, you are witnessing the kind of outright subversion of sort of like Western style forms of like social regulation, social democracies, and Marxism. And in doing so, like, they're not going to deregulate at all. That was not the hope that we were going to see out of a lot of Beijingologists at the turn of the 21st century. But instead, we've witnessed the sort of loyalty to the party, loyalty to the nation, loyalty to the people. And if you are going to try and pursue something for yourself, you will be guilty of it, and the state will execute you. And so we're going to enforce this top down and embrace what comes with us, which is this sort of cold global system in which we're going to try our best to wrangle in doing so. And whereas in the West, and we're about to see here, the fate of conservatism just gets more depressing.
Yes, it does. Neoconservatism junks paleo-revolutionism because it understands that postmodern or climaxed cynicism capital is saturated by critique, and that it merely clocks up theoretical antagonism as inconsequential redundancy. Communist iconography has become raw material for the advertising industry, and denunciations of the spectacle sell interactive multimedia. The left degenerates into, again, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce this, Socratic, which I have down here. It's the military or police influence over governmental policy. Collaboration with pseudo-organic unities of self, family, community, nation, with their defensive strategies of repression, projection, denial, censorship, exclusion, and restriction. The real danger comes from elsewhere. So once again, it's talking about how communism has basically just been subsumed into this system. You can sell it. You can sell its iconography. It becomes fuel for the advertising agencies, and the left just becomes this desperate attempt to kind of create this police military complex to control this process. It's given up on some of its more revolutionary aspects in the desperate hope to kind of regain control over this process and turn it to the interest once again of the nation or the governing entity.
Yeah, and I think that this paragraph's got a lot that you can really break down here. I think one of the important ones, of course, is that it's always saturated by critique. It merely clocks up theoretical antagonism with inconsequential redundancy. It feels like a lot of the sort of commentary space with conservative ink, but also in the same way that like the Republican Party just reifies itself to say, well, we won't stand for this. Beautiful loser syndrome continues even as it tries to quote unquote not be neoconservative. Still very much is. We can sell communist iconography, whether it be like the Hope Obama posters or like Che Guevara t-shirts, like those ideologies, and by extension, it's hagiographies of its martyrs, remember the martyrs of labor or something like that. All of that becomes something that which you can just hop onto, and it becomes this like kitschified fan identity that you can buy into and you can trade with. And in doing so, it allows you to say, well, like not my cat. I don't want that to be the thing that we're going to sacrifice on the altar, but instead we'll allow it to happen elsewhere. This is why you still get that Western visceral disgust to like say Chinese TikTok videos about animals being eaten in a certain way. But instead, like that threat always being from elsewhere. I mean, this is everything that's being mentioned here about what the left is going to degenerate into: self, family, community, and nation. Well, America, we've witnessed this a lot, especially at the DNC. Like the left was trying to project themselves as the real Americans, the real Christians, with the real family values, even though we advocate for the murdering of children. And we also want self-identification, that human desire for being validated or being seen. This is why you have the intersectional identitarian framework. It doesn't matter what letter you are under the alphabet soup of people, you are heckin' valid. And in doing so, you've now created a way to be repressive, project your actual tactics onto the enemies. That's why you see every Democrat pundit being like, Trump will weaponize the FBI against his political enemies. Not like you don't do that against white people anyway. And the real danger comes from elsewhere. It doesn't come from the left. It comes from as the President Biden had said, the most vile threat to American security as it is like white supremacy. Despite the fact that it really isn't. But this is the way where we are. This is how the left has degenerated since Land talked about this in 1994. We're 30 years later, and some of this has kind of been pretty accurate.
Yeah, again, it's a essay at this point that is 30 years old. So a lot of these predictions are prescient. I think a lot of it still holds up, but of course, it's not going to be perfect. He has himself expressed frustrations with some of these understandings, and so this is not set in stone. This is itself a snapshot of a certain time, a certain read on the way that history was going to move. I think it's valuable in that it still gives us a lot of insights and can even in its failures show us where things might have gone wrong, what he misunderstood about a process, or what he didn't predict about some of these changes that would come. So it is certainly an interesting thing to review in light of that as well. But that said, we will go ahead and stop here because we're approaching an hour. Still leaves us plenty, so don't worry, guys. We've still got a few more Theory Fridays of unpacking Meltdown. If you haven't gotten enough of your schizophrenic, political philosophy, then don't worry. We'll be serving it up for the next couple of Friday episodes. But moving over to the questions of people, actually, before we move to the questions of the people, Prude, where can people find your work?
Well, as always, Oren, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, my friend, as well as to your wonderful audience. You can find me over on YouTube, on Twitter, or X, as you like to call it, Substack, as the Prudentialist. Just look for this lovely amphibian, and you will find me most of the time. I am live on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. I do a show called The Digital Archipelago. I write a variety of articles. I had one just out earlier this week for the Old Glory Club about that lovely phrase, nothing ever happens, as sort of a way that people try to keep out news and psyops from their mental system and good psychic hygiene. But on top of that, I was just live earlier this morning with our good friend Ens van Zyl from Conscious Caracol in South Africa. We talked about the 24-hour a day, 7 days a week news cycle and what that means in the digital age and how it feels like history and our perception of time is always going faster. It fits very well with this little stream that we just did here. If you're interested, and by all means, you can, like I said, find me anywhere where the amphibian is. And I appreciate coming on as always, Warren.
Absolutely. Only the finest frogs here on the show. Let's go to Perspicacious Heretic here. He says, I acknowledge my part in adding hard words to say. Yes, I appreciate that. Hopefully, it's an adventure when you're having to read something like this live. So
it's a fun land. It's a land acknowledgement. It's fine.
That's right. It's all part of it. If you don't stumble over a few words, are you even reading Nick Land? Robert Weinsfield here says, is consumerism the GAE religion? It's obviously a critical component to that. I really think that gay race communism is probably the best amalgamation of kind of what it means to have the empire and its belief system as we have now. Or progressive secular humanism is one of my favorites to describe kind of the overarching, metaphysical, to the extent that I even believe that exists, belief of the current order. But consumerism is certainly something that is at the beating heart of it. Which is why I think it's important. Paul Gottfried constantly harps on this, that while it might be communist, it's not specifically Marxist in its embrace of. It actually embraces capital for all of its work, and that's why just dismissing this as Marxism is a bad understanding. Because if it was Marxist, it would not have so radically embraced the process that Marx himself was not a huge fan of.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to hammer home is that while the word communism might be a 19th century, new phrase that does come from Marx and Engels, there is a big difference between what person might call communism versus like the traditional, little o orthodox Marxism that you still see some people cling on to. Because if you even go back to like, the Virginia colony before it was like failing, there were people like so desperate for fairness and our fair share of things that people would wait till sundown so they could scurry what little they could to eat in private before there was, you have private property, you have land, you're going to work, and if you don't work, you will not eat and you will die. Like before any sense of like what we would consider to be that sort of like waspy, capitalistic, Protestant work ethic marketplace, like we had communism in numerous other places. And I think that it's important to look at that because those old degenerative, bring everything down to mush and we will fight each other for the last resource isn't necessarily just a Marxist idea of trying to reject and have a bourgeoisie-free society. No, like the whole idea that we can just, destroy the haves and make sure that the have-nots get what they want, and then we'll, have this perfect society. It's been around before. The little o Marxism is just not there in this sense of the term. I think Gottfried is absolutely right, and I think history is a good way to look in the past towards these other kind of Chiliastic, utopianistic experiments that existed way before Marx and are not just unique to the West.
Yeah, I'm relatively sure that socialism pre-existed Marx as well. Marxist socialism is not the only strain of that, though it obviously is basically become synonymous at this point. So, Marx is certainly working in something, and was revolutionary and heavily influential on it. But it's not an idea or a notion or a system that is entirely new to him. He did not just birth it from the ground up. Also, I noticed in the chat people saying that the essay sounds Marxist, which I just want to remind people we certainly addressed that in the first one. But remember, Nick Land has said first, he used a lot of Marxist language because that was the language of the academy at the time. And so he is using the language that is taken seriously by theorists at the time. But he himself was not necessarily embracing Marxism. He was using Marx's analysis of critique of capitalism on a regular basis. But it is pretty notable that, and pretty important that he is embracing that. He is saying, I am with this process. This process is inevitable. This process is inescapable. In fact, this process is the process by which we overcome the human in a very Nietzschean sense. And so in that way, I'm actually citing. So even if he's using a Marxist analysis to some extent, he's only doing it in the sense that he is siding with capital. He's siding with this process of trying to reach the outside. And so in that sense, yeah, sure, you have Marxist language being thrown around here. People will smell that, but he is only doing that in the sense that that was what was being spoken at the time, and also he is citing against quite definitively the goals that someone like Marx would have.
Yeah, and remember, Deleuze himself never called himself a Marxist. He did utilize the language, but again, he's trying to not necessarily just critique Marxism, but also apply his own views to it in the same way that like Freud or Marx themselves looked at Adam Smith's idea of capitalism and the wealth of nations. And I mean, also, if you want to talk about like where Nick Land is now, well, I mean, Nick Land is considered a fascist by all of his old CCRU friends. Right. I mean, there are people that openly disavow him despite loving his work, who are just leftists to the core. And at the same time, I think that, just by the simple fact that Nick's work is considered kind of foundational to a lot of people who would not consider themselves traditionally right-wing, but definitely have right-wing beliefs. I think it's important to look at this because I use leftist language all the time. I've read a lot of the stuff that he's citing, but I was sure as hell would not identify with Marx or with anyone that wants to destroy my country or my people or anything like that.
Yeah, there's a channel called Theory Underground, and to give them their due, they have a really good series on Nick Land. Even though they are definitely people of the left, they certainly would seem to probably describe themselves as Marxist. But it's really funny when they get to all the neo-reactionary stuff. They get very angry. Like it's all very dismissive. They don't bother to interact with the material because it's just too right wing. So yeah, even if you they found Nick Land worth like 15 hours of dissection, but they still disavow large chunks of his work. So if that does anything for you, there you go. Let's see. Constant Manifold. I'm not schizophrenic. I just appreciate the culture. Very good. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. I hope you have a great weekend. If this is your first time on the channel, of course, make sure that you subscribe, click the notifications, the bell, and everything so that you know when we go live. Of course, if you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron McIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you do leave a rating or review, it really helps with the algorithm. This is also going up on Rumble again. I got the Rumble channel uploads working again, though for some reason I still can't get the stream direct over there yet, so the streams will go up after. But if Rumble is your preferred method of consumption along with Odyssey and Blaze TV and YouTube and the podcast, you have so many ways to watch this. All right, guys. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Prude, for joining me once again. And as always, I will talk to you next time.